What's up? What's up? This is Zach Boschman checking in. You're locked into the Citizen Truth podcast. We are honored today to have Dr. Oliver Boyd-Barrett on the podcast. He's the author of Media Imperialism, among other books. Dr. Barrett, let's get right into it. What is media imperialism?
Media imperialism is a term that's has been defined differently by different people, but essentially the way that I use it, the term media imperialism refers to all of the ways in which the operations activities of mainstream media engage with, support, or sometimes resist actual imperialism. Some people in talking about this engagement with issues of imperialism, some people have concentrated in the past, have concentrated on the intimidating size and power of the big Western media behemoths. Today, they would include organizations like Facebook or Apple or Amazon or Comcast or Universal Comcast or the News Corporation and its successors. And it's said that these organizations are so powerful and have now been around for so long that they monopolize communication space, if you will, in a way that ensures that a few powerful authoritative sources get to control the message about whatever is going on around the world, and very few alternative voices get to be heard. So that is one of the principal ways in which the term media imperialism used. I just prefer to, these days, I prefer simply to use it to refer to the many ways in which Western mainstream media support the imperialistic activities of the Western nations under the leadership, of course, of the United States, and how they control the message about any of the current instances of imperialism that we look at today. That would include, for example, what's going on in Syria, or what is going on, what went on in Libya, or what went on in Iraq, and what is going on right now all around the borders of Russia.
So one thing you mentioned in your book is Operation Mockingbird. For the people who don't know, what was that?
Well, the term Operation Mockingbird, there is some debate as to whether it was ever actually, the term was actually ever used by the CIA, but whether or not it was actually formally used is beside the point. We have copious evidence of massive CIA-funded attempts to control communication space throughout the Cold War years. The revelations began to come out during the 1970s as a result of 3 or 4 congressional investigations. They included the Church Commission. That was a Senate investigation. There was the Pike investigation, which was a House of Representatives investigation. There was a Rockefeller Commission. All of these sources, together with some noted journalistic exposures that included the work of celebrated investigative journalists such as Carl Bernstein, still at that time working for, I believe it was Rolling Stone, and then Seymour Hersh, who had already been catapulted to fame because of his exposures of My Lai in Vietnam. And all of these sources exposed the extent to which the CIA had infiltrated the Western mainstream media, to the extent that there were hundreds of mainstream journalists on the CIA payrolls, and that the people who were included in the CIA payroll included not just regular pedestrian journalists, but also the the owners and managers of some of the major media organizations of that time. So yes, that's where we began to discover the extent of this phenomenon, and then we can talk about what has happened since the 1970s.
Yes, that gets right into my next question. Is the mainstream media today still infiltrated by intelligence agencies?
Yeah, I think to answer that question, we have to get it into a little bit of the nuance of all of this. There are many different ways in which journalism and intelligence agencies cooperate, collaborate, and not infrequently are complicit in the distribution, in the dissemination of propaganda. So on a workaday level, you have the phenomenon where often foreign correspondents, not always necessarily foreign, but foreign correspondents who have working relationships with sources in the intelligence community. It'd be difficult for them to do their jobs if they didn't actually have those kind of relationships. That is not particularly surprising, but the problem always is that when you're dealing with prestigious and powerful sources like that, you decide that you're going to use them, you're in very grave danger after a little while of then beginning to do favors, either because they treat you very well, they offer you information that you didn't necessarily ask for, that goes beyond the call of duty, so to speak. You begin to feel that you owe them favors. You begin to feel that you need to highlight and to privilege particular spins or particular narratives that they are feeding you. And you know very well that they're probably trash, but you do it anyway because you need to safeguard that source. Also, they can do you grave harm. They can damage your career unless you play along with this game. Do foreign correspondents also engage with intelligence agencies other than United States intelligence agencies? Yes, they do. So whatever we say about relationships between mainstream journalism and Western journalism and the CIA, we could also say of with respect to British intelligence agencies, German intelligence, the intelligence agencies of pretty much any nation that belongs to NATO. And but do they also collaborate with the intelligence agencies in any other part of the world, maybe Russia or China? Well, not nearly to the same degree, if at all. So the Western intelligence agencies have considerable influence. I've talked about this relationship being a day-to-day relationship that sometimes develops into something a little bit more sinister. So it beggars the imagination. It beggars my imagination, Zach. You do an imaginative experiment. The kind of mental exercise, mental discipline that Albert Einstein once recommended. You ask yourself, if you are engaged in a competitive political environment, you have the greatest resource, the best resourced intelligence agencies in the world. You know that the dissemination of information, and in particular the dissemination of propaganda, absolutely depends on persuading mass media to play along with the narratives that you want to prioritize. It beggars belief that if that is the situation which you are in, you don't press the levers that are in front of you, that are available to you very, very easily. So is there bribery? Are there threats? Of course. Do sometimes intelligence agencies recruit journalists so that, in fact, the journalists are answerable to the intelligence agencies over and above their commitments to their media employers? Of course. Do intelligence agencies sometimes actually plant their own people in the media so that they can operate at the very center of media operations? Yes, yes, they do. Not merely to propagate or to disseminate propaganda, but also because media is such valuable assets that allow you to operate unseen in many parts of the world where you might not otherwise have access, where you're not able to say hand on heart that I'm a journalist. So in all these and in other ways, more recently, we've seen a development of of secondary organizations that are linked to the intelligence establishment, but then are used by journalists. So I would say that an interesting example of this is Bellingcat, for example, Bellingcat.com, which is supposedly an independent organization that was set up by one man in Leicester in the United Kingdom a decade or so ago, and is now regularly used as a source for some of the most difficult and controversial issues around the world, from what's going on in Syria to whether the Russians are behind the Catalan independence movement. All of these things, all of a sudden, the media are quoting without critical qualification this supposedly one-man operation. Of course, it's no longer one man. And Alan MacLeod of FAIR.org fame did a very recent, interesting expose of the personnel that currently work for Bellingcat.com, and showed that many of them have links to the military and intelligence apparatus, and then many of these go on, they are fed into the media world after they stop working for Bellingcat.com. I'm not saying, so in addition to that, we have a whole raft, a swath of so-called non-government organizations, a very distracting descriptor, by the way, that notion of non-government organization. They nearly always, nearly all of them seem to take huge funding from governments, and only that you can say, well, they're not actually part of the civil service or the bureaucracy of any particular government. But in the case of the UK, over the last few years, we've seen an extraordinary succession of exposures of different propaganda organizations, front organizations, many of them supposedly humanitarian, that are funded by the British government and get involved in information operations, sometimes a very sinister operations, such as, for example, the White Helmets. There's an association between a supposed non-government organization, ARC, deeply in the pocket of the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, ARC's relationship to the gentleman who founded the White Helmets, Le Mesurier, and how that White Helmets operation was sustained. Le Mesurier was a British military character, and then many people ask themselves, who was he working for at the time that he collaborated with ARC in the setting up of the White Helmets? So you see, this question of the relationship between intelligence and the media over time has gotten more and more complex. In some of the ways that I have described. However, the overall purpose of this whole thing hasn't really changed over the past 100 years. It's basically, you're in the propaganda business, you want to smear some people, you want to glorify some other people, you want to put some lies out there which will suit you. Sometimes you don't need the lies to be believed for very long. It doesn't matter if the lie is exposed as a lie next year, because maybe next year, hopefully next year, you would have won the battle and everyone would have totally forgotten. So for example, I always think of the babies in the incubators example from the Iraq war back in 1990 to 1991. It was a propaganda campaign. I don't say it was necessarily an intelligence propaganda, but Hill and Norton were behind it, so a bona fide public relations agency, but with very interesting links to the White House at that time and to some major players in Congress. And so they spin this story about how Iraqi troops in who are invading Kuwait are going into hospitals, as though they didn't have anything else to do. They go into hospitals and take babies out of incubators and leave the babies on the floor to die because they want the incubators. When you think about it, it's really just an absurd and silly story, which most people would recognize instantly as a typical example of atrocity propaganda. The thing about atrocity propaganda in which intelligence agencies routinely become involved is that sometimes it's true, then it's easier to use, and propaganda is usually better when it's actually based in reality. But oftentimes you actually have to invent it because you actually don't have the necessary images, and you don't have the necessary documentation. So you invent something that may or may not be based in any kind of reality, but you have to come up with fabricated evidence, whether documentary or visual or whatever it is, and you go with that. And that's precisely the kind of activity that intelligence agencies are good for. That's what they do for a living.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to talk about the alleged April 2018 chemical attack in Douma, Syria. The mass media said Assad is using chemical weapons on his own people. You seem to come to the conclusion in your book that was doubtful. Can you kind of speak to how you arrived at that?
Yeah, just a small correction, Zach, if you will allow me. My book was published in 2015, so I do have a chapter which deals with this kind of propaganda in both Libya and in Syria. But when I was writing, the scandal du jour was still the alleged chemical weapons attack on rebels in East Ghouta being a distant suburb of Damascus. And when I looked at the evidence, it just seemed to me that there were all kinds of suspicions as to whether Assad was really culpable. Whereas, of course, the mainstream media, this is what they do, they just went with the one story and either ignored, more usually simply ignored, or poo-pooed any contrary evidence. Ted Postal was one of the better sources of evidence on this. He's a missile expert. He's now emeritus of MIT and also Stanford University, and he was one of the most serious investigators of this alleged chemical weapons attack. And he, with his colleague, came to the conclusion that everything that was being alleged could be shown to be empirically false. So we had a number of these instances throughout the Syrian conflict. So East Ghouta 2000 and I'm forgetting, I think it's 2013, 2014, East Ghouta, and then you got Khan Shaykhun in 2017, then you got Douma in 2018. There are others as well, but it's these three major allegations that have captured most of the controversy. The most interesting and most important aspect of the Douma 2018 allegations it's very questionable whether there was any kind of chemical attack at all. Mm-hmm. At least in East Ghouta and in Khan Shaykhun, you could find evidence of some kind of chemical weapons. The issue was, well, yeah, but who had actually used them? Was this a false flag operation, or was it really Assad? But in Douma, it's very questionable whether there were any. You could show that there were traces of chlorine, but then you can show that there are traces of chlorine practically anywhere you go in the world. You'll find traces of chlorine.
In drinking water, probably, right?
Yeah, exactly. But the most important aspect of, apart from the fact that reputable journalists were going into Douma very soon after the attack and finding that the evidence was very unclear, and that many people on the ground were professing not to have been aware of any kind of aerial attack, but thought that there may have been conventional bombing that had caused suffocation with some of the buildings that had been targeted by conventional bombs, and that may have been then exaggerated by local jihadists on the ground who were in control of Douma in this period. By the way, would have been very difficult, to stage to gotten away with this without the jihadists already being in control of the city, and the jihadists may have grossly exaggerated what had happened. The problem with Douma, this is something that even the skeptics find it very difficult to talk about. You've got the bodies. Real people were killed. The question is, how were they killed? Where were they killed? Who killed them? Mm-hmm. And were the bodies repositioned for the purposes of a false flag attack? Now, my examination of the evidence suggests that yes, the bodies were repositioned. They were hauled in to this building. Everything about this situation is totally fabricated. I am concerned about the bodies, and then once you start facing that reality, real people are killed, then you have to, you can decide that's not terribly interesting. You can decide, well, let's just forget about the bodies because that's really very uncomfortable. But if you're in the business of propaganda analysis, no, you can't, you don't have that luxury. You gotta start really asking the very difficult questions. Where do these bodies come from? But I'm going to move quickly to perhaps the single most important aspect of the whole Douma episode, which is that the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, did go into Douma way too late to undertake their investigations. Their draft report, their inspector's draft report, was very skeptical of the evidence that they found. At most, perhaps some chlorine. Certainly not anything more sinister than that. And but their draft report was smothered. As we now know, it's very clear this was smothered at the very top of the OPCW hierarchy. The OPCW hierarchy determined that the narrative has to be that Assad staged a chemical weapons attack on Douma, and that's all. That has now been exposed. The whistleblowers from the OPCW have come forward. Their accounts are credible, and the OPCW, instead of trying to deal with this situation transparently, has tried to cover it up through smearing, and is now in a very bad place indeed. And of course, the trouble for NATO and for the entire Western world is that depends on organizations like the OPCW to sustain these narratives of humanitarian crimes that then become alleged crimes that then become pretexts for Western intervention in the pursuit of Western foreign policy objectives, which we can broadly refer to as neoliberal objectives and, in effect, world domination. These countries depend on organizations like the OPCW to come out with the right kind of findings to support these humanitarian pretexts. This is all beginning to crumble, not just because of OPCW, but across the board, particularly as in the wake of the allegations of this raft of non-profit humanitarian organizations that are actually being funded by the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office and all the other shenanigans that are being played, particularly by Britain. Britain seems to be some kind, almost like the propaganda hothouse of the NATO cabal. All of this is beginning to crumble, and I think they're very worried. The people behind all of this, who are paid to make this run and to make it work, I think they're beginning to realize that it's simply not working. And they're looking, by the day, they're looking sillier and sillier.
Awesome. So do you have time for one more question?
Of course.
So, what something very relevant right now is the war on Palestine, and due to the fact that you're a scholar, on media, I'd like to get your take on the mainstream media coverage in the U.S. on that war.
Zach, it's the same as we have seen throughout this entire horrible, depressing story of Palestine since the foundation of Israel in the 1940s. But it's only gotten worse over time. So the Palestinians and in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. These are the territories, the only territories now that remain Palestinian, whittled down to a mere fraction of the land that was originally occupied by the Palestinians prior to the foundation of the state of Israel. And now they are under occupation. Sometimes the occupation takes the form of Israeli troops on the ground, or most of the time it's simply that these people trapped in these small territorial enclaves have no freedom to leave. Practically all of their relations with the external world are controlled and suppressed by the Israelis, and should they do the slightest thing that annoys or irritates Israel, then they are subjected to this totally disproportionate barrage of hate and war crime and murder. And this time is somewhat worse than on most of the previous occasions. But it's still the same boring story, or tedious, horrible story in which, for the most part, there are some exceptions. But for the most part, the story is about how, the Palestinians are being controlled by this terrorist organization, Hamas, and that Hamas is a front organization for Iran, and we don't know quite why Iran is so horrible, but it's Israel doesn't like Iran, and therefore the fact that Iran has links to Hamas must be a terrible thing, and totally justifies murdering women and children. What is it, 60 children now murdered, Palestinian children murdered already, about 230 Palestinians so far murdered by Israel, and what about 20 Israelis unfortunately have also lost their lives, probably as a result of the firing of these totally inept, inaccurate, badly put together rockets from Palestinian territories. So the mainstream Western media will treat Palestine and Israel as though these were two equal warring parties who, for absurd reasons, seem to insist on not getting on well with one another. And aren't they silly? And if only they were British, or if only they were American, or if only they were French, they would see the error of their ways, and they would sit around the table, have a glass of wine, and sort it all out in a very sensible, rational sort of way. What rubbish this is! If you have a knife to the throat of a child, and you keep that knife to the throat of a child for years and years and years, is this an equal relationship? Of course it isn't. It is horrific. It's every bit as disgusting as what went on in the concentration camps under the Nazis. And of course now Israel has better learned this lesson from the Nazis about how you subjugate and oppress and humiliate an entire people. The Israelis seem to have learned this lesson better than anyone else around the globe. And the Western media play into that narrative.
Dr.
Oh, and so
Barrett. Go
I
ahead.
beg your pardon. I'm sorry, Zach,
No
but
worries.
just kind of link it back
Yeah.
to the beginning of this conversation. So the question then is, well, why do the mainstream media insist on playing this game? And then I throw back that question to those who ask it. I say, well, you think that all the journalists and all the editors and senior editors and all the people who own the mainstream media are absolutely stupid? Maybe, but I don't think they're stupid. I think most of them are pretty smart, but they also realize what they have to do to be allowed to continue to exist, to make money um, in their Western markets. Because in order to be allowed to exist, you have to play the game that the system, the corporate, military, industrial complex requires you to play. You have to tell the story according to what the State Department tells you it is, or according to what the Foreign and Commonwealth Office tells you that it is. That is why the story remains so unchanging, so eternal, and so eternally wrong.
Dr. Barrett, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Great conversation.
Very welcome, Zach. Take good care.